welcome everyone. Uh, Appreciate the opportunity to be here with Bill Snape, who is the Senior Counsel at the Center for Biological Diversity. He coordinates the center's legal and policy work from Washington, D.C., a graduate of the University of California at Los Angeles, who received his law degree from George Washington University, a writer of numerous articles on conservation and litigation, and has been in the center of many federal environmental cases over his career. Also, besides working at the center, he teaches at American University's Washington College of Law and somewhat appropriately, formerly coached swimming at Gallaudet University, where he was named Conference Coach of the Year 4 times. And I say appropriately because my guess is, Bill, that you are, given the work and the organization you're with, you're constantly, both personally and organizationally, trying metaphorically to keep your head above water. Not an easy thing, probably. So welcome. Appreciate you taking the time to talk about the work.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Great. So just, a little personal background. How did you first become involved with the Center for Biological Diversity?
So for most of my legal professional career, I have been in the arena of environmental law, whether it be wildlife law or climate law or toxics law. That I've been pulled in a few directions, but for many years, I was the chief counsel and vice president of a group called Defenders of Wildlife, and worked with this, at that point, young and upstart group called the Southwest Center for Biological Diversity, later changed its name to Center. And I became friends with Karan Suckling, who's now the executive director, and then came over to the center in late 2006, and I've been with the center ever since. And it's been a great ride. It's a very diverse group, if I can use that word. That's in its actual title. Not only because we protect all forms of life on Earth, but because it's a group that is very much conscious of larger social justice issues. So it's a privilege to work for them, and we do a lot of work not only in protecting species and habitats, and of course climate, as I've mentioned, but absolutely have gotten into the political arena and seen the power of corporations. They are not all the time, but many times the enemy. And I'll just stop at that point where I am.
Okay. And, feeding upon and focusing on the emphasis of diversity beyond climate, can you just share a little bit about that work and the diverse work of the group?
Well, like many socially conscious groups, whether they're environmental groups or other types of civic groups, the groundswell, the change of understanding that to have a healthy environment, to have a healthy environmental movement, you need to have people of all stripes and colors and affinities. And for many years, I think the environmental movement was pretty white and pretty male. And I think it still is a little bit that way. I am, of course, that, but the Center for Biological Diversity and many groups have really taken great strides, not only at the staff level, but the board level and leadership levels, to be conscious of that. And I think one of the most exciting political developments in my entire adult life was and is the continuing Green New Deal effort from 2018. I recognize there was never one bill passed that was called the Green New Deal, but the infusion of youth and diversity and intelligence and just verve that was injected, and ever since, by people under 30, gives me hope that the environmental movement will eventually, that we will all be successful in saving our planet from ruin. So that the young people do give me hope.
Well, hearing your commitment organizationally to diversity in terms of people, and trying to bring on board and in leadership people who have been historically the most oppressed and on the front lines, is extremely important. So kudos to the work, the commitment, and the dedication to the principles and values. So what current projects are you organizationally working on that you're responding to, resisting to, trying to prevent even more horrors from taking place than what already exists?
So the Center for Biological Diversity, we have several programs, and we have lawyers and scientists and activists and all sorts of different types of professionals. But most of our activism and advocacy is to make mostly the federal government follow the law, to follow the Endangered Species Act, to follow the public land statutes, to follow the National Environmental Policy Act, which is our environmental impact statement law. And what I have found in my over 30 years of practice is that when you're suing an agency for not following the law, well over 95% of the time, the reason why the agency is not following the law is because of pressure, political pressure, moneyed pressure. And almost always that moneyed pressure has a corporation behind it, not only wielding its power in courts or in the administrative sense in terms of how agencies make decisions, but most importantly in how Congress even passes laws. So even though the vast majority of my cases over the last 30 years have been against a government agency, not all, but most, I would say with all of those cases, there was a moneyed interest behind it that was really causing the problem. And in many ways, the government agency wasn't caught in the middle. That's not quite fair. It's their job to enforce the law, but on some level was caught in the middle, not wanting to make a hard choice, or at least not wanting to make a hard choice that was the right choice.
So when you talk about the, regulatory agencies that you have done battle with in courts, to what extent would you say the lack of following the law, because we know law is only as good as its enforcement, what extent or what percentage of would you say that the reason behind it is just maybe lack of professionalism, lack of knowledge versus just the political pressure that is coming from it? I mean, it's possible to know for sure one way or the other. Just your feel from the arguments made by the agencies themselves and trying to read the tea leaves and understanding the rhetoric, how much it may be mirroring that of the companies or the interests behind them.
So I think where we're getting to is that these agencies become captured by the regulated industries they're supposed to be overseeing. And I think the best way to answer your good question is to look at the BP oil disaster of 2011. It seems like that's a long time ago now, and it is, of course, 12 years ago. But what's amazing about that story is, as we sit here and talk, and as disastrous as that oil gusher was, and thousands and millions of wildlife species and people were harmed by that by that accident, we are now still drilling for as much oil in the Gulf of Mexico as we ever were. There was a slight pause as we all acted concerned and attempted to clean it up. It's still a mess down there, by the way. But we've learned that oil drilling in the Gulf of Mexico is a disaster, but we can't help ourselves because the oil and gas companies were able, as soon as that sort of blew over and there was a new crisis, were able to convince the government, even this Biden administration, which promised not to do it, issuing new leases and issuing new applications to drill in the Gulf of Mexico, the very place that 10 years ago we all said we would, try to protect. And that's not the only place we're drilling for oil and gas. I mean, I deal with climate and energy policy probably 75% of my time now as a legal advocate. And I used to resist this temptation as a young lawyer to say it the way I'm about to say it, but the oil and gas companies call the shots. They don't always get their way, but they get their way well over 90% of the time. And once you realize that they've got the executive branch oiled, pardon the pun, they've got the legislative branch, they've got the best lawyers money can buy, including many judges who used to work for them. You recognize just the sort of depth of their power. Yeah, I'll leave it right there.
So you're talking about the totality of not just regulatory agencies, but statutory arenas and backed up by the courts. If you
Exactly.
And suing, and okay, I'm going to go after regulatory agencies. I'm going to try to find relief in the courts. You're not finding relief in the courts.
Exactly. And the best example of that at the legislative level are the series of acts in the mid 2004, 6, 8. 2006 was the big one, but there were a few others that now accompany it. What we call the Energy Policy Act, which was basically the give away everything to the natural gas industry act. Unbelievable. I mean, we know as a result of that act, we're not allowed to regulate safe drinking water and clean water from oil and gas fracking operations. Oil and gas fracking operations get to decide with their oil companies whether they're going to apply eminent domain and take someone's private property away so that they can have a big oil pipeline go through their land. I mean, that is the most unfair, inequitable, horrible environmental bill ever, and not even beyond environmental, just sort of people bill. We can't overturn it. It's been almost 20 years now, 20 years and 17 years, and that law is still in the books. It's still creating havoc, and they're at this point not even an effort to overturn it.
Yeah.
So even though it should be overturned, so that's an example at the legislative level. And at the judicial level, yes, there are some good judges out there, and I hesitate to use the word progressive because that's become a label in its own word. But I'm just going to, independent, fair-minded judges who actually really will call balls and strikes and not come in with their predisposed view. There are still a few judges like that on both sides of the aisle. But wow, the Trump administration did a great job in getting a slew of very far-right judges in. And then when Democrats like Biden and Obama pick judges, they tend to pick like the nice corporate lawyers as opposed to the evil corporate lawyers. So you end up, Biden has tried to change that a little bit in his defense. There have been more, I think, public interest judges finally being nominated, but the federal judiciary is dominated by corporate lawyers, 100% dominated by.
I know Ralph Nader has written some stuff about that there should be a litmus test among lawyers who are up, or judges who are up for promoting, as to what extent do they have a corporate background. And if they have corporate background, okay, but they need to be balanced by those lawyers representing environmental groups or labor groups or consumer interests, and not just all left versus right corporate lawyers.
Exactly.
So whether it's in the regulatory arena or in Congress, in whatever experience you've had directly, or the organization that your colleagues work with, how much difference have you found between Democrats and Republicans in terms of the corporate influence and the receptivity or lack thereof to being influenced?
So I'm not going to say that there's no difference. I know that is, for some activists in this area, a tempting thing to say. And there are some bad days that I almost will say that and believe it, but it actually really isn't true. It is true that the Democratic Party is beholden to corporations because corporations have a lot of power. And it is true that, I don't know, roughly half, maybe more of the Democratic Party is relatively moderate and conservative in that corporate sense. But there is a wing of the Democratic Party that is not like that. And I think the Democratic Party at least allows itself to have those debates. At this point in time, unlike 20 years ago, where you could find Republicans that would buck the trend, the Republican Party is a corporate party. It is whatever big oil and gas or big church or big whatever wants them to do. It is all about fastballs all the time. It is all about just, one or two trick pony type slogans. It is amazing the degree in which the homogeneity of that party in terms of big corporate actors is full. And what's odd about it is and we may not get more into it because I'm not even sure I know the answer, but the marriage of big oil and gas with big church and big religion is perhaps the most bizarre marriage of them all, but it's there in the Republican Party. It's there. And that's not maybe every Republican, but at this point, it's well over 85-90% of the federal Republicans. I mean, the House of Representatives on the Republican side is a clown show right now.
Yeah. When you've been in the court litigating, trying to make the government uphold its agencies uphold its laws, and or having do battle with companies, have you or any colleagues experienced the argument of companies saying, I shouldn't have to disclose this or shouldn't have to do whatever I'm being demanded to do because I have corporate constitutional rights, using that as a shield, as a protector, as a justification for not complying, not having to be accountable? to the public or to agencies?
Yes, with a slight twist. The work, at least the work I have done in the natural resources wildlife arena, usually is one step detached from that. So it isn't corporations arguing that. It's what I run into most frequently is corporations or the government arguing for the corporations. We can't release that data, for instance, on oil and gas fracking dangerous chemicals, because that's a business confidential piece of information. So you can't know that.
So
Or the pharmaceutical,
the proprietary.
exactly, proprietary. Or
Yeah.
the pharmaceutical companies that are killing literally millions or bleeding horseshoe crabs along the Atlantic coast, literally driving that species near extinction right now. No state will release that data right now on where the horseshoe crabs are actually being taken and how many, because that's business confidential proprietary information. So I see it usually rearing. I mean, I'm aware of the way at the Citizens United state, where corporations do argue that, but I see it much more in terms of their ability to shield data from public oversight, data that would be pretty damning to the activity that they're engaged in.
Mm-hmm. So that might take the form, just looking at this from the corporate constitutional rights angle. Companies might argue one or both of the corporate right not to speak, which they've argued in a variety of different cases. I believe, like Monsanto corporations argued that in not releasing the glyphosate information. Or they may argue the Fourth Amendment search and seizure, privacy rights.
Right.
Shouldn't have to release that because that's a violation. You shouldn't have to force me to release that because I should have the right, just like you have privacy, although do we really have privacy rights anymore given the internet and everything else? But search and seizure rights. So inspectors, that's sort of been argued by companies to avoid inspections by any public entity, any regulatory entity, because particularly warrantless inspections.
Right.
And now when it comes to environmental concerns, oftentimes they argue the Fifth Amendment due process or takings rights that, if you're trying to, keep, particularly in the environmental sphere around climate, as many climate advocates argue, we need to keep ultimately this in the ground, not burn it more cleanly, not burn it at all, not mine it, keep it in the ground. Well, the companies retort, well, to do that, that is basically a takings, a potential loss of future profits, which could amount in the, when it comes to core, any of the coal, natural gas, oil, in potentially the tens of trillions of dollars. So that's a pretty hefty deterrent.
I totally agree with you. That was well stated. I won't even attempt to add to it. I will just note that you were reeling off the various constitutional mechanisms by which corporations do protect their property rights or what their perceived proprietary rights. There's two others I want to point out, though, that are consistent with, and one is a corollary to what you're talking about. The one that's consistent is the one power that Congress has that is almost absolute is to make rules and regulations regarding federal property, both personal property and real property. And as it relates to real property, whether it be national parks, national forests, or BLM lands, or refuge lands, or DOD lands, almost a third of our country is owned by the federal government, mostly in the West, a lot in Alaska, but we also were sitting on a lot of oil and gas reserves. And again, like 25% of our reserves are on those lands. The fact that we cannot stop sticking our straw into the ground to suck out oil and gas is an abomination, and it is all based upon the dynamic that you just talked about. Yeah. The corollary issue, and perhaps among the more insidious tools that corporations use, are things called SLAPP suits, strategic litigation against public participation, where they will bring a case against a group. Greenpeace has had a few leveled against it. The Center for Biological Diversity, we've been subject to a few. I'm still on a board of a group called U.S. Climate Action Network. We had one filed against us. And so they all differ, and they're usually brought under state law, but they have the common denominator that a company or interest that feels as though it has been aggrieved publicly in terms of what an environmental group or a citizen says about it, that's a ravenous pig who's just sucking all the oil out of the ground, and then they'll sue for defamation, libel type actions. And even if they know if the corporation knows that it's not going to win, but that it's at least passed the red face test, for some smaller groups, that's like a death wish. No one wants to be dealing with ExxonMobil filing a lawsuit against it. No normal person. I actually would sort of like it, but most people would find that an abomination. And that happens all the time. Like that's happening, and it's happening now even more so because the proprietary interests are now getting to state legislatures and criminalizing peaceful protests.
That's right.
The Dakotas, because of the Dakota Access Pipeline, the very effective Dakota Access Pipeline protests. The Dakotas passed laws, criminalizing that behavior. And that's not just in the Dakotas, it's happening in a lot of states. So those are just related and other mechanisms by which the corporations flex their muscles and get their property interests put ahead of everyone else's.
Yeah, those are in the statutory legal sphere that, of course, can be stopped if there was legislation. I know, who was it? Wasn't it, or isn't it Jamie Braxton? I think it's just introduced something that would be an anti-SLAPP suit bill to try to prevent that. I mean, of course, there's also forced arbitration that's been used, and there's tort, so-called reform that's been an effort, all of which are ways that, again, provide protective bubble around these companies, or in the case of the SLAPP suits, provide, just as you described, a chilling effect, incredible chilling effect. And what's the guy's name? Murray from Murray Energy has been maybe at the forefront in knowing that maybe he's going to lose, but so what? I will make a case out of this. I will
put the defendant through hell, and they'll think twice before they come after me again. That's exactly right.
You bleed them, and even if the case is dropped, so what? You sent a message, and a very incredible one.
One thing you just said, first of all, Jamie Raskin used to teach with me at American University Law School. I used to teach with him, as the more appropriate terminology. A great guy, and as someone who really is an independent thinker. But I wanted to point out that, yes, there are federal things that Congress can do, but a lot of these laws are state-driven. And I think that our communities have begun to do a better job in dealing with state legislatures. But in the earlier part of the century, the wackadoodle right took off and dominated a number of state legislatures, and still does. And that continues to be actually a huge problem. That is a little bit going under the radar, but I know different than what we're talking about today. But
no question about it. There is a role for statutory reforms that even we at Move to Amend are talking about, to serve as a complement or supplement to the work of actually amending the Constitution. That are stepping stones, if you will, because of course, statutory reforms or changes, positives that can be created today or done today can be undone tomorrow. So they have a place. Ultimately, we're looking at constitutional change, but certainly statutory reforms have a place. So this sort of leads into again, hear about moving toward strategies. What are, besides litigation following the law, that the work you do, what other kind of strategies has the center done to achieve its work, both by itself and with others?
So we do frequently use the law to sort of leverage situations, but we've come to recognize, and we always recognize, we just have grown, so we've got a little bit of ability to do this, that the best lawsuit in the world can be overridden by Congress if you don't have a campaign behind it. And if you don't have a clear articulation of the scientific and public policy issues that are at stake in a plain and meaningful, so it doesn't seem as though it's the lizard versus the county of so-and-so. It's the lizard and the people versus the, one corporation that doesn't care about any of it. So you have to, and media obviously becomes a part of that. So I would say the most effective campaigns are the ones that combine all of that. We have not yet hit the sweet spot with regard to climate policy. I think we're still taking one step forward and one step back in this country with climate policy. It is good that we're using and expanding renewable energy, but the grip of oil and gas is still pretty big. I would say we've had our greatest successes so far at the state and regional level, stopping development projects that we're able to convince either a court or the court of public opinion is a horrible idea. So we have a lot of litigation and advocacy in California to not be building in fire zones right now, because the real estate industry seems to conveniently forget that sometimes, or in flood zones. We're very much a part of trying to have the states and the users of the Colorado River water system understand that the river is completely oversubscribed and we should not be giving away any more water to any entity from that river system. So, the center has so many campaigns, I can't even keep track of all of them anymore. I used to be able to, I don't anymore. But I will say this, and I know this is the sort of the general topic of our discussion today. Part of that is, and to some people this is just inherent and obvious, but we try to draw the explicit line that corporations absolutely should be serving the people and the societies under which they're created. This idea that a corporation has as much constitutional power as an actual human being citizen is sort of ludicrous. And most people think it's ludicrous if you can break it down like that, but it's frequently hard to get it to that point. But it has become abundantly clear, and there are some states that have begun to do this, that it needs to become clear that corporations are beholden to the state and not vice versa. The corporations, through their corporate charter, can be dissolved if a state so decided. They really are artificial beasts, and that, to the extent we're focusing on these issues, is how we have focused on it. But you know more than I do, so I'll stop right there on that.
Well, you all have got at least ahead of the learning curve on this, because organizationally you have endorsed our effort of trying to have an amendment. Yes, we need certainly to elect better people. Those are elected officials. We need better laws. We need better regulations, but we also need to change the fundamental rules of the game. And that's what constitutions are, right? Codification of values and principles. They're fundamental grounding rules that are overarching or undergirding, pick your favorite metaphor. And so this is an important piece of what it is we do. And it's a way to fundamentally, other than one at a time, through the chartering process, which, as you were familiar with, used to be the way corporations were controlled, were defined, were authorized, sort of akin to a license that a professional person, right, a doctor, a lawyer, or an architect, to practice his or her business, they would have to get a license that would adhere to certain standards that the state would set up. Well, that's what a corporate charter is. And if the state found that that company wasn't providing a useful good and service, or trying to go into banking when they were chartered to build a mill, guess what? Their charter was revoked by either the state legislature or the courts. And that was routine. That was a given. And,
but I want to bring it back to the oil and gas companies that I spend a lot of my time either battling directly or indirectly. And just the fact that they can spend billions of dollars that are not disclosed, that go through these other groups that have innocuous sounding names, is really the largest tragedy in American democracy right now. And it does need to end. It absolutely is killing us. It does make impossible rational discourse. And I think on a microcosm level, what we're learning about Justice Thomas and the sort of joyride he's been on financially as a justice is, it's a different issue, but it's all a part of the same very wretched web of secret money. And until that money becomes more obvious and more accounted for, we're going to continue to have these I'm convinced of it. I used to always resist as a young lawyer saying that, oh, the system is corrupt, but I don't like saying it. I don't always say it, but when pressed and forced, the system is corrupt, because it is ultimately influenced by the moneyed interests who don't really care about the rules. They care about them winning, and them winning only. And it really is undermining small d democracy. It's absolutely undermining the ideals that our constitutional founders, as imperfect as those white male were, it absolutely, what's happening now is at odds with the vision that's in the Constitution. I've come to absolutely agree that. And until we solve that secret money problem, we're not going to be able to solve too many other problems.
Yeah, some call it legalized bribery. You know, that it's something that has just become so blatant, so wide and deep that it's everywhere and has almost become perceived of as the norm. But people do understand it. People increasingly are against it. This amendment that we're proposing have these two provisions. One, to declare that a corporation is not a person. And the second is that money is not speech. It's property. Money is speech. Those who have the most money have the most speech. That ain't democracy. We've never had it, right? We, the people, have never been all the people. I mean, that's true. And so all we're trying to do is create something that would be halfway decent for the very first time, you know, which would be pretty good. So the work of how can people become more involved in what it is you're doing? Organization.
Visit our website, www.biologicaldiversity.org. We have a very cool website, and you'll see the different programs we have. I think 7 or 8 different programs, maybe more, but ranging from endangered species and public lands to population and sustainability, public health, oceans, urban wildlands. So check out the website. Certainly people can contact me at bsnape@biologicaldiversity.org. And then lastly, get involved at a local level.
Yep.
Yeah, I think local groups doing work on the ground are some of the best groups out there.
Do you have, per se, affiliates or organizations you know, closely align with at a local level, or how do you relate to people at a local or regional level?
We do not technically have affiliates, although we do have state programs in about 15 states now, dispersed throughout the country. But we work with local conservation groups all the time, whether it's a local Audubon Society or a local Sierra Club chapter or just a local We Love the River chapter of whatever. Right. We work with citizens on the ground all the time. We have the most number of grassroots organizers in the organization since I began working there. So the group has put a lot of investment into people who talk to people and mobilize people. And so, yes, there's, for those who want to join the center and get involved, there are ample opportunities, and we welcome it.
And your email address again?
Snape, BSNAPE @biologicaldiversity, one word, .org.
Great. And just before we end up, so how do you see the connections between the work that you're doing now and the need to focus on sort of constitutional work and change? How do you see it sort of? I mean, you painted a picture before of the need to work both inside and outside, inside the courts and outside on the streets, and building a movement, if you will, a people's movement, working with the media, working with people in the court. So how do you see this work on the constitutional level fitting in?
So I think it's a two-step process. I think the first is there has to be a realization that there is a problem. You and I know there's a problem. I think a large number of people and a growing number of people realize there's a problem, but I think we're maybe not quite yet at the tipping point of full awareness. So I think just understanding that every single major, not only environmental problem, every single, whether it's people getting shot to death, every single one of these problems has corporate money and interests fueling that problem, and doing so in a way that none of us have exposed in its own milieu that we would find fair. So I think first is just getting more people to understand the dynamic. Once that occurs, then it becomes just the biggest mass mobilization we've seen. And I think the 2018 youth movement that took power away from Donald Trump in 2018, flipped the House in ways that no one would have imagined was possible in 2000. We take it all for granted now, but they flipped districts that had been Republican for years by just going young, going with the true messages, not the milquetoast messages that sometimes those corporations are giving either party. And I think we've got a chance at that point. I think most younger people are ready for that type of fresh change. And I think that's what it's going to take. I am not at all confident that the people in our crowd, if I will, Craig, I'm not convinced that they're the answer on this question. I think they're locked in on ways that I think the younger generations are not. And that's how I see it playing out.
Yeah, there is this growing awareness of the corporate control, the corporate rule that transcends political party, transcends place, transcends issue. Just we have found in doing the work, our organizations, there's over 700 organizations that have endorsed what we're doing. There's over 700 municipalities that have passed either municipal resolutions or ballot initiatives, including
Yeah.
8 states. 8 states have either put something on the ballot that's passed, even the radical places like Montana. And
I think you're onto something. I mean, I think we forget in 2016 that there were a number of voters who had Sanders and Trump as 1-2 or 2-1. Now, that was before I think we fully understood the horror show that was Donald and is Donald Trump. But I think it shows you that on the right and the left, there is absolute corporate skepticism. I agree with that. And I think the biggest divide right now maybe is to bridge the urban rural divide. There's still some mistrust there. But I agree that all states, if the message is right, all citizens and all Americans would find it compelling to have our country run by actual human beings and not corporations. Most people end up believing that on some level or another. But it's hard, as I said, big church, as an example, can mix that message and confuse that message sometimes. So it's going to be a matter of constant pressure, constantly applied.
Doing what it is you're doing and what we're trying to do, which is constantly trying to work on the inside, work with legislators like what we're trying to do. And we have this amendment introduced again, HJR 54 is the number, but on the outside, just as important. Change always involves changing the law and changing the culture. You got to do it together. And so the Center for Biological Diversity is a good example of that work. And thanks for continuing it. I appreciate your insights, the support organizationally you've made. Hopefully we can continue or figure out ways to work more closely together. Thank you so much.
Greg, thank you so much for your time. I really had a good time. Thank you.
Yeah, take care now.
Bye-bye now.